All right, so we're going to do just a little bit of the American West in this era. It's called the Gilded Age. I'll talk a little bit more about the Gilded Age, and you've already read about that or reading about that in chapter 17 and chapter 18. And just to review, I did assign the rest of chapter, get my numbers right, 18 about the New West, and that'll be due tomorrow. But I gave you over a week and a half since I've assigned chapter 17 and the first half of 19. And you have that note packet to turn in. A lot of you have turned it in. And what I'm doing is I'm giving a lot of points for that. And I'm grading very, you're going to get a lot of benefit of the doubt to get it in early. But I'm giving you extra credit on top of that. So I'll do that in the grade book. If I do miss the extra credit or get the dates wrong, let me know. Obviously, the closer we get to Friday, the less points you'll get. But it does tell me the date and time you turn it in. So when I get done with this and have a little bit of time this afternoon, I'm going to go through and grade a bunch of stuff. And so yesterday we talked about the New West. And so went through basically, started kind of the sharecropping, that new economic system of virtual slavery. By the way, can you hear me? Screen coming up good? Okay. Virtual slavery, and then going to Jim Crow laws, the Mississippi Plan, aka voter suppression, and the Grandfather's Clause. Jim Crow and Grandfather's Clause aren't necessarily the same thing, but they go hand in hand. Jim Crow are laws, and laws can't be infected unless you vote. And so you deprive people the right to vote, and they're stuck with these laws. And get people distracted, don't feel part of the government, terrify them so they'd rather not participate. Getting people to be apathetic towards government does the same exact thing, ironically. And Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal, went through the New South, the lost cause, Reconstruction myth, Gone with the Wind myth, sundown towns, rebirth of the Klan, birth of the nation, all of that stuff. So when we get to the unit test on this, I'm going to ask very specific questions about, is it recording? Good. About Reconstruction, about sundown towns, about the economic system. What I'll do is I'll give you a few choices, but you will have to know that. And I'm asking for specific things that I talked about in class. I mean, the book does fine, and other places do fine, but this is a lot more in depth than you'll see there. Sorry, my mouse on. Yeah, come on, let's go. Okay, I got my laser pointer. All right, and so let's get to the New West, because this happened almost at the same time, and they are very much tied together. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened up this area to popular sovereignty in 1754, which helped lead to the Civil War and Bleeding Kansas. You can really see the beginnings of this New West after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And you notice this is 1870 to 1900. Gilded Age is the name given to the dramatic changes in the United States after the Civil War, with the flowering of the first Industrial Revolution, and something I'll talk about very briefly tomorrow, the Second Industrial Revolution. And so, just a sec. I need a producer. Okay, good. And I will drop this assignment for these notes right after class. My assumption is everything goes right. Okay, so when people talked about the West, and the most popular genre of the first movies, the first television shows, the first radio shows, all the way up until the early 1970s, were Westerns. When they refer to that, they're talking about this basic area here, the Plains, the West, the last area that the United States would take very brutally from the people who lived there and form them into states. And you'll notice this big wave of territories that all came in about the time of the Civil War. That's not coincidental. The United States wanted these territories to become with governments that are pro-union during the war. And you also notice Nevada becoming a state because the Republicans at that time were no fools. They wanted the 2 electoral votes for Nevada, same with West Virginia. This was the area that was created by the Indian Removal Act, originally as part of Kansas. And eventually we'll open that up later on. So, West in the Gilded Age. And so this area, the last of the American Indians to not be conquered. And don't forget, part of the conquering was, in fact, the biggest part was absolute devastation by disease. And we've talked about Tippecanoe and Indian removal, the Creek War and the Sauk and the Fox War. But the Plains Indians, relatively nomadic for logical reasons. It doesn't rain. And there's not going to be very many groups. You know, they will practice family planning, aka birth control. You know, you can't have large families if you're moving all the time, and there could be shortages of food. Very nomadic. They would follow. I put down buffalo because that's what they always called them at that time. Yes, technically they are the bison. I try to do both. Just deal with it. And following bison herds, the introduction of the horse by the Spanish, I guess a better way to put it is the reintroduction in the 16th century, gave these nomadic tribes a great amount of mobility. Some would become fantastic light cavalry. Probably the best, as I mentioned before, were the Comanche and the Kiowa down in the south, the southern part like Texas, but also the Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, etc. And they conflicted and fought each other. Don't forget, one of the things that happened all the way from the very beginning of English and Spanish colonizations, we're talking back to King Philip's War and the Powhatan War, etc., was dividing and conquering these tribes. And so with that, this is the area of what we consider the Great Plains. This is approximately the rain line, it rains less than 20 inches a year. So dry plains, a lot of mobility, hunker down in the winter. Get food in the summer, hunker down in the winter. And this is a great painting, a watercolor from about 1850, hunting by horseback of bison. With the combination of disease, the bison herds were massive by 1800, maybe 60 million, significantly greater than they were just 100 years earlier. And they were still 40 million or so by 1850. That number would drop down to virtually nothing in 35 years. But in 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty, and Fort Laramie is right about there. If you ever get a chance, go there. It's a pretty amazing place. The Fort Laramie Treaty basically divvied up this land forever to American Indians, with the promise that the American Indians would not stop these various trails from going through the territory to get to here. Yes, of course, there's no alliance with the American Indian tribes here that were devastated by disease and just overwhelmed by citizens of the United States. But you'll notice a trail right there called the Bozeman Trail. That would be a key issue of going right through some of the best hunting land of the Northern Plains tribes, specifically the Lakota, Sioux, and the Cheyenne. But, well, actually the Cheyenne, a little bit more down here, but yeah. And the United States would violate this treaty many times. Not to say American Indian tribes did not sometimes violate it either. But this, it's a little simplistic, but here in dark were areas controlled by American Indian tribes in the dark brown. And as you can see, by 1972, it is just a few tiny little reservations. Here is by tribe, and this is very vague. It's a European tradition that's starting about the 17th century, where Europeans want to border everything by definite borders, which we're so used to, we just think is normal. But one of the first real big intrusions by citizens of the United States violating the Fort Laramie Treaty was mining. And we live in Helena, Montana. Helena, Montana was started by mining. And a number of booms. In fact, that's why Nevada would become a state in 1864. Mining interests and boom towns would pop up. And here we have placer mining. There's a sluice. Hydraulic mining would be very effective, using water taper down pipes all the way down to a very narrow nozzle and shoot water. Just a sec. This would be a very effective way. Now, the environmental waste for mining would be massive, unloading amounts of arsenic and various, and mercury is another big one, into the water supply that still exists. If you go to one of these old mines, don't touch your mouth after walking through. That's a long story. But also a lot of immigrants from China came in. We've already mentioned a little bit about that yesterday. But mining came in, and the big thing they did is they crossed American Indians' land that was given to them by the treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty, and also started hunting, especially hunting large numbers of bison to feed the miners. And so usually they're going to land that the American Indians didn't necessarily want. We're not to the Black Hills yet, but this would be the first real big intrusion. This is before and after the Civil War. Okay, come on, come on, come on. And I love this one. This is just a Google map. All the red dots are the various gold mines in this part of the United States since 1840. And it's actually pretty shocking how many gold mines there have been. But so gold and silver were the biggie, but then later on, copper, lead, and zinc. And I should add, wherever there's silver, there's copper. That's just pretty much the norm. And so like Butte, gold, and then vast amounts of silver. When the silver became less valuable, just at a time when copper became key, when we have electrification used for wires and what's called the second industrial revolution. And the Comstock lode, which was right here near Virginia City, Nevada, would be the first really big boom after the California gold rush. This boom of gold and silver, just massive strikes of gold. And this was a big deal because it happened right at the beginning of the Civil War. And then Colorado would be the next one. In fact, it's no coincidence that Denver's going to boom as a center for commerce for all these mining cities in here. And you'll notice when you see it in Montana too, which would come a year after. So we got about 1860, 1862, 1863. So Bannock, Virginia City, and of course, Helena. And I mentioned this in class yesterday, a little bit about Montana, and Helena was a very Confederate town. Former Confederates found it. Well, current Confederates, the Civil War was going on. It's named after a town in Arkansas, partially because there was a series of battles that were fought there around Helena, Arkansas. And, not huge battles to our point of view today, but big battles for the time. And I live about 4 blocks from Davis Street, which is named after Jefferson Davis. I live a block away from Breckenridge Avenue, named after John C. Breckenridge. And that's why after the birth of the nation, they built the Confederate monument here. But food was such an important necessity for the miners, obviously, that would be the really big intrusion in the Plains Indian tribes, who are for the most part left alone. Devastated by disease, a massive truck has just pulled up in front of our house. Sorry, it's hard not to notice things like this. Oh, there's just some guy on the phone. You like the running commentary? And the first big intrusion into the Plains tribe. Yes, when settlers going to California, Oregon would cross her, yes, they would kill bison, but not like the miners did. And you really see it here in Colorado, because it's right in this stretch right here. If you've ever been to this part of Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, it's really wild because you have this line of mountains. Colorado's mountain peaks on that eastern edge are just spectacular, just this line of mountains, and then flat, incredible bison range. In fact, this whole area, just great for bison, but here. And so you have out of Denver would become a major center for hunters to go out and kill bison for the miners. And other things we'll get to in a sec. But you have to combine this with the Transcontinental Railroad Act. And this one cannot be underestimated how important this was. Now, it's called the Transcontinental Railroad Act. What it means, it's going to build a railroad that will get to the Pacific Ocean. It will link with other railroads, making it a sea-to-sea railroad. It's not actually a railroad one railroad that will connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. But it will connect with railroads here, specifically railroads like the Pennsylvania or the Illinois Central right here, and connect to the Pacific Ocean. It was passed in 1862. Why could they pass it in 1862? Civil War. There's no Southern members of Congress. The Democrats, who distrusted the Republicans on this issue because it's a massive giveaway to companies, they didn't have the votes. Republicans had the majority. So what they gave to build this railroad, and I'll talk about, well, a couple different times, but were massive land grants. Just gave away land owned by the U.S. government, and they gave them to railroads. Now, it wasn't that the railroads were going to use all this land just simply as a right-of-way to build the track. It was significantly greater than what it is, than what they needed for the track. What the point of the land was, they would give this land that everybody knew would be valuable because the railroads will be on there, and people want to live next to the railroad. I mean, think about it. Your land is a lot more valuable if it's next to a road. And just a sec. Okay. And they would sell the land and use that money to build the railroad. And then they would give low interest or basically no interest loans. They don't have to pay interest on it. And what that means is free money. I mean, if you are starting a business, or ask your parents if they're going to start a business and how nice it would have been if they got free money, meaning they could borrow it without paying interest. Wow, that's a massive, massive aid for business. And basically it was $1,600 per mile. Oh, give me a sec. Everybody, sorry. Got kind of an emergency message from I have to respond to this. I know, it's painful. Okay, I'm back. Did you miss me? I put $16, but it's $16,000. No interest, free money to build on flat land. It's $32,000 to build on foothills. $48,000 of free money to build in mountains. Obviously, because each won't be more expensive to build through in mountains, you have to tunnel and cut trestle or cut roads and build trestles or things like that. That's a significant amount of free money. And a decade later, they would double all of that. So give even more free money. I mean, that's basically telling the two companies they picked to build this, the federal government's going to give you this money and guarantee your survival because we're giving you all this money. The federal government needs these railroads to survive to get part of this back, which the federal government would. This is not necessarily good or bad, but it's massive government aid for business. Unbelievable. We'll talk more about this later. And with that, think about how much money they're going to get. Right here, this gradual land right here, the Central Pacific Railroad was going through. And I'm jumping up. I'll save this story because it's so exciting. But let's backtrack. You see this area right here? All this area where my little pointer is, that designates the boundary of the land given to the railroad. Look how immense amount of land that is across Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, all the way to California. Future Transcontinental Acts would give, for example, this huge amount of land to the Santa Fe Railroad, the Southern Pacific, or look across Montana. You're in land, probably on land. If we're a capital, I would say right now we are on land that was given to the Northern Pacific Railroad and then they sold. This is massive government aid for big business. Now, I'm not making a value judgment, but if anybody thinks that these businesses just by their own pluck and determination made it, no. They lobbied Congress, they gave outright bribes and got this done. But the land was in a checkerboard pattern. Now you notice, and I kept it, for some reason I typed this checkerboard. I don't know why, but I loved it. It was every other section was given to it. So it wasn't all of this. It was a checkerboard pattern. So this map exaggerates by half. Doesn't mean it's not huge, but it exaggerates. So that is the land grants. And that would be given to the railroads. So that, I just want to make sure we got that. And so the first Transcontinental Railroad would actually be two. The Central Pacific Railroad would, and soon be called the Western Pacific, but the CP would start in about Sacramento. And they would go east. The Sierra Nevadas, high peaks, rugged mountains. It might snow. A snowstorm might go through there on the windward peaks and blow and give literally 100 inches of snow in one afternoon. Just incredible amount of snow. So a difficult area they have to go this way. The Union Pacific would start in Omaha and go across this way. They're going to have more land, but you notice a lot of this is like across Nebraska, it's flat. So they don't get as much money. Here, a lot more money. In Leland Stanford, the owner of the Central Pacific Railroad, wanted mountains right here, or foothills right here that were just the beginnings of foothills going up the Sierra Nevada. He wanted them to be mountains. So he found a compliant geologist by the name of Josiah Whitney to say, oh yes, they're mountains. And since no one from Washington, D.C. knew, and everybody was kind of, they're giving each other bribes, he said these foothills were mountains, and that's $16,000 more per mile of free money. And big deal that when Leland Stanford became governor of California, he named the highest peak in California and the continental United States, Mount Whitney, after this geologist. So here's across Nebraska, and remember it's a checkerboard pattern, but still look at the amount of land. And there are going to be cities all along here, everything from Lincoln to Grand Island to Kearney to North Platte, etc. And that means that they have, if you want to live in these cities along the railroad, the odds are you're going to have to pay the railroads. What a big, big giveaway to business. Not necessarily bad, not necessarily good, but important to understand. So the Central Pacific coming westward, they used a lot of laborers that were contracted from China. China, okay, I think in terms of almost like serfdom, or we talked about in sharecropping. They would be sold by brokers, and these poor workers would be basically forced to go work for the Central Pacific, paid almost nothing, yet usually the person back in China who organized it would clean up. Thousands would die, especially going through the Sierra Nevadas, and most would eventually go back to China. About 60 to 70% would go back to China. It was the work there, get a little bit of money to go back to China. China was going through, from their absolute heights 300 years ago, through a massive decline. There was a huge rebellion. There was famine, opium wars, etc. The Union Pacific used a significant amount of former slaves, who a lot of them stayed. Most of the first, what we call in the 20th century cowboys, not most, but probably 40% were former slaves. Yes, I know all the movies. They are very much of European descent, but you know how movies are. And used a lot of immigrants. So I thought I put down freedmen, but I didn't, but a lot of freedmen, and then a significant number of immigrants from Germany, France, Italy, and of course, Ireland. And so a lot of these workers, no matter if they're freed slaves or from what is now Bulgaria, they're going to be called paddies, named as a generic term for Irish immigrant. And here they are very hastily laying the track for the railroad, and boy, it was a race. They were laying as fast as they could, because for every mile west the Union Pacific moved, that's more money. Same with the Central Pacific. And so they built this railroad as a race of both of them coming this way, with the idea is they'll get it done faster. In fact, faster to get more money. The grading crews that were leveling it out, when they got into Wyoming or Utah, they passed each other and just kept going. And finally, the federal government had to step in. And they would force them to meet in Promontory Point, Utah. And I should have put a map here. This is one thing about if I would add class. Promontory Point, Utah, north of Salt Lake City. And we're not going to all the details how this was a dramatic change for Utah, but that's another story. And they met there. There was a massive celebration. It's hard to see in this picture, but they're all carrying bottles of alcohol. This was a huge deal. And like, for example, there's Leland Stanford right here. And they had this symbolic two trains met. And they had a big celebration planned. President Grant was there. Promontory Point, 1869. The thought was this would become a city, and they tried to put a city there, but eventually they would make a connector rail down to Salt Lake City, and it would disappear. But if you've ever been there, and I recommend it, it's really a neat place and a great museum, but it is one of the more desolate places I've ever been. The dry northern plains, high plains of Utah, wow, that it would be a hard place to live. So no town ever turned up. But they had this big celebration plan, and the whole plan was to connect a telegraph line to the actual rail so they could get signals back from them pounding in the spikes. So the last spikes, they pounded in a silver spike, an amalgamated gold and silver, a golden spike, and yes, immediately they took out the spikes, so they're not there. And then the last spike was going to be iron, but that iron spike would connect two telegraph lines. And the idea was it would connect, and that would connect the lines, and they would pass a signal, a straight tone, just that would go down both telegraph lines all the way to Sacramento, all the way to Washington, D.C., New York City. For the plan was for massive celebration. So it was a big kind of symbolic thing, and Leland Stanford would be the one to pound in that last spike. So when he pounded in, they'd been drinking for like 5 days straight, and he was so drunk he could barely stand up. So when he got his sledgehammer, it was staggering. They had to kind of turn him there, and he banged that last hit and missed by about 3 feet and fell down. Well, the telegraph operator just went, he pushed the button, connected the line, celebrations began. And these guys got super rich off of this. But it's a big celebration, massive parties. In fact, one of the funny ones is in Sacramento, a big banner came down, California annexes the United States. A big symbolic effort, a huge technological change, and the end of the Plains Indians. Because once you have the railroad, this is going to bring in miners, people, buffalo hunters, and everything would change. So here's a picture, a more stylized picture of a very noble-looking Leland Stanford about ready to do that last spike, when no, it was not like that at all. So there's Stanford. He'd become he was the president of the Central Pacific. He'd become governor of California. He would become an incredibly rich man. He was known as being not only duplicitous, but a ruthless and cruel businessman. And his reputation would really suffer for this. Thus, to improve his reputation, like a lot of businessmen at this time, and people do all the time, they found something that he could tie his name to. Have you ever heard of Stanford University? Yes, he started a college. So people think about him as a beacon of higher learning and not a duplicitous businessman who drove smaller companies into bankruptcy and starved families. Another story. But yes, also a builder. He's a complex man. Who isn't? And eventually, the railroads, you'd have the 4 main transcontinentals, Northern Pacific, the Central Pacific, Union Pacific connection. This is the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific. And so one of the big scandals, and we'll have to get to this a little bit later, the Credit Mobilier scandal would be a classic example of the kind of games that companies would play with the money. But I have to talk about this again because this is a classic example of how business and government became married at this time. So we will come back to the Credit Mobilier. One thing that's going to come out of this, and I have to bring it up here, even though it fits in with the most racist time in history, the first ever anti-immigration law that put a stop on immigration would be passed because of this, to stop Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act. I know, this is shocking. People are brought in there brought in for incredibly dangerous work and underpaid, and then forced out. And so here it is. Look at the way it put, yes, the noble United States kicking out, and look at the way they caricature Chinese immigrants. And here is one showing the great fear of the period, that Uncle Sam might be swallowed by foreigners. And this is the nativist anti-immigrant argument that goes to this day. But here is an Irish immigrant and Chinese immigrant swallowing Uncle Sam, and then the Chinese immigrant swallows the Irishman. The racism, remember what I told you, was huge, the most racist time in history. But look at what happened once they built the Transcontinentals. So 1860, the bulk of the railroads were in the north. Here's 1870, where you have the first transcontinental was built. 1880, you start seeing a lot more expansion. Look by 1890. And then 1950. Today, not near as many railroads, and in fact, it's about 130,000 today. This map's a little bit old, but a massive expansion of railroads. This would change everything. And so, we're jumping right here. And here is a shot of a Union Pacific passenger line. And yes, they would do this from the rails. Take pot shots at the buffalo herds. In fact, the railroad immediately split the buffalo herd into northern and southern herds, like immediately. And this would help trigger the Plains Indian Wars. So you have miners wanting food on the trails that go through there to supply the miners with the railroads. 1860, 1890. I have to go through this fairly fast, but this map is a very generic map showing all the various fights. Here, the red lines would be trails and railroads. Here's the Northern Pacific, Central Pacific. And there are fights all over. We are not going to talk about many, but let's talk about a few and set it up. And one of the first will be right here called Sand Creek. Before we get to that, let's get to the American stress tactics. I'm sorry, the map was in. Oh, let me show you what that is. This is a little bit better map, and this shows just the wars in the 6 years from 1862 to 1868. And look at all the fighting and the forts the United States would build. Forts are designed, if you build a fort, that is a way to subdue the native population. So the U.S. tactics in this, the United States would follow the tactics that colonizers would use from day one. The tactics. First off, divide and conquer. They know the tribes fight each other all the time. This is what the Puritans did in King Philip's War. The U.S. did the Tecumseh, the Creek War, picking one side over the other. They know the tribes fight all the time. Most famously, the Lakota Sioux who lived right here, they were mortal enemies to the massive Crow tribe here. In fact, the Lakota would do raids, steal everything from the Crow. So the United States used Crow scouts and used the Crow to subdue the Lakota, and then would turn on the Crow. Also, for the Cheyenne too, the Crow and the Cheyenne despise each other too, and that's why you have irony of ironies as a legacy of the reservation system. The massive Crow Reservation is right next to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and they despise each other. But next, divide and conquer, defeat and subdue, and then they call it the concentration policy, but we look at it as reservations. Force them on reservations. So put them on land so there will be control. With the idea is at first the United States will feed them, and then we as a whole country will be assimilated together, whatever that means. And then lastly, those who refuse to go to the reservations, come on, total war. Total war. Sometimes it's called economic war. Remember, and this will be done by a blanket of forts that will subdue and kind of surround the Plains Indians, because if there's forts, it's very difficult to be nomadic because you're always running to another fort, but also as a base for hunters. And remember, total war. This is if you can't beat a battle and beat them on one battle, wage war on everybody. So everybody in the tribe is a combatant. So you hunt them down, you run them down, you kill them, you do sneak attacks. But the big thing is you starve them to death. If they can't eat on the plains, they have no choice to go to the reservation and totally submit. And so when I said hunters, yes, hunters. The target would be, and I don't think I wrote this down, but I should have. The target would be, and please write this down, the bison. You send the buffalo hunters out, they kill the bison by the thousands, they'll be starved and have to go back. And it's important to understand that the men who are going to command the operations of total war to build the forts and run down the Plains Indians or force them on reservations were the very same men who learned how to win a war during the Civil War. William Tecumseh Sherman would be the commander of all of the United States Army when Grant was president. The commander of the Department of the Missouri, so Montana, that whole area, much of the plains, would be Philip Sheridan, who would become Grant's cavalry leader. And so that's where they learned to fight. And then Ulysses is Grant's president. And Grant would try what he called the peace policy, but it was still force on reservations. And the thing about it is that Plains Indians, they were not very many. There just weren't very many. But they were masters of hit and run and hiding. To actually fight them for the United States Army, to defeat them and force them on reservations is really hard because they would run away and then raid and hit and run tactics. So Sand Creek in Colorado would be one of the first. Colorado miners by the mid-1860s were needing food. The Cheyenne tribes of the Southern Plains began to attack the buffalo hunters. Logically, they could realize the buffalo hunters are taking our food. And so, and don't forget, this is during the Civil War. In 1864, okay, we know today, the North was going to win. But in the summer of 1864, this was clearly a questionable endeavor. It was the United States going to win? We don't know. McClellan might win the election. The North might have to quit the fight. And so they saw the Cheyenne also as like maybe they're being helped by the Confederacy. We need the gold. And so U.S. militia was sent out to hit the Cheyenne. The commander of a regiment of these militia was Colonel John Shivington, a Denver businessman. They had trained the militia. They were moderately trained, but think about it. During the Civil War, they were pretty well trained because of fear of Confederate attack. Just south of Colorado, there were still Confederates. And they knew, the United States knew that many of the tribes that were in Indian territory were allied to the Confederates because they hated the U.S. So Shivington was sent out in the winter of 1864 to go find the Cheyenne. The problem they were having was this. The Cheyenne would just see this ill-trained militia coming and run away. That's part of the reason why the U.S. Army would campaign in the winter. They know the Plains Indians would hunker down in the winter. They would go into camp because it's hard to move around in the very cold, high plains. And that's when you attack. Hit and run, surprise attacks. Oh yeah, horrifically brutal. Horrifically brutal. And then the U.S. would turn around and say that's what the American Indians would do. But anyways, they couldn't find them. They came across a small group of Cheyenne who their warrior chief was a man by the name of Black Kettle. And the U.S. only dealt with men, so it kind of never dealt with the complexities of how tribes, men and women in tribes. So we're just going to focus on that. Black Kettle had signed a treaty saying they would not hunt or they would not fight buffalo hunters. And they were even flying a U.S. flag to show that they were peace Indians. Soon they would be called treaty Indians. Shivington couldn't find anybody else, knew they were Cheyenne, attacked anyways. One Cheyenne's as good as another. And a complete surprise attack on supposed allies. And this would turn into, what's called the Sand Creek Massacre. Now you notice this put up by the Colorado state government as a battleground. No, this was a massacre. They rode in and killed everybody they could find. A total surprise attack early in that cold November morning. And eventually over 200 men, women, and children would be killed. Mostly the people who could not flee, so young children or the elderly, were cut down. Shivington ordered his men to kill children with the very famous and horrific statement when he was asked, should we kill the children? And he said, nits make lice. Nits are lice eggs. Kill them all. And this massacre would be a symbolic, arguably beginning of what's the last part of the Plains War. To attack, use women and children as targets, sometimes even kidnapping, use them as hostages, and massacre. Sand Creek would be this infamous beginning, and we'll get to the infamous end in a few minutes. But soon they'll be fighting all over the plains. Sand Creek is right here. And there'll be a series of fights up here. You'll notice they're down here too. The southern tribe, there are more settlers here at first, and the southern bison herd would be destroyed. Eventually, at a place called Washita, it will hardly a battle. Black Kettles, it's be Black Kettles again. He would be killed 4 years later. Ironically, would seen as a great victory under a cavalry regiment called the 7th Cavalry that was under their second in command, a fine Civil War general named George Custer. Then he'd go off to fight the Klan, then come back. But the buffalo hunters were, once the railroads came, they came out and they started just destroying the buffalo herds. And the amount of bison they killed, it's hard to even wrap your mind around. Millions of buffalo. And they would bring these flat things to the railroad, the railheads, like here in Dodge City, Kansas. Here are 40,000 buffalo skins. Basically, buffalo did not run away. The bison didn't run away. So all you had to do is shoot the lead bison and then one by one pick them off until basically you ran out of ammunition. And yes, Cheyenne or Lakota, whoever, they would hunt and kill buffalo hunters. But they still killed them by the thousands. They left the meat to rot on the plains. They would take those hides back, cut them into it's really thick leather, and use them for belts for the new manufacturing, for the new factories that are farming up. And here's the biggie, and I should have typed this in. I'm going to type this in now so I don't forget it. When the buffalo hunters began to be killed, that's when the Army came in to defend the buffalo hunters, and those would be the last battles. And this was all part of the war. The U.S. would supply them with protection, ammunition, kill the bison. The Plains Indians would have to go to reservations. And so, where's my mouse? A couple last things before we quit. Come on. So you can see as the railroads grew, the first railroads are coming to here because of the importance of Colorado, and the bison would be destroyed. The last herd would be this northern buffalo herd, and that's where the Lakota and Cheyenne were. Here is a picture a little bit later showing them scooping up the buffalo bones, because in 1860 there were probably 30 to 40 million bison on the plains. By the mid-1870s, there was less than 10 million. And by 1888, there was about 2,000 bison left. It's an absolute miracle all the bison were killed. When you go see bison, especially places like Yellowstone where there's bison everywhere, Yellowstone National Park, just imagine a plains of thousands of these bison. But you would think there'd be bones all over. Like, for example, this massive mountain of skulls. By the way, a lot of movies we use the reference of this picture. It's one of the more famous ones, stacking them up near a railhead. This is in Kansas. It didn't really happen this way, but they use this as early as like the 1820s. Like, come on, what's that? The Revenant uses this. Not true, not yet. But anyways, they gathered them all up. You cannot find a bison bone on the plains or a bison skull. You think you could. They put them on trains. They took them back east, ground them up, and used that bone meal as fertilizer. And that's how come there are no bison bones on the plains. But a couple wars we got to get to very quickly. The first one, the last couple things for today, Red Cloud's War. Red Cloud's War happened on the Bozeman Trail. Why is there the Bozeman Trail? It goes up from the Oregon Trail and then soon the Union Pacific Railroad, but connects the new mines in Montana so they could get food. The Lakota Sioux, along with the Cheyenne, endeavored to cut it off. Red Cloud was one of the leading warriors, already a pretty elderly man, but there's Red Cloud right there. And they endeavored to cut off the Bozeman Trail because it went right through their prime buffalo hunting around. And outside of Fort Phil Kearny, for example, 100 cavalry under Captain John Fetterman rode out to try to attack the Lakota, and they would be ambushed and 100 would be killed. Basically, the Lakota laid siege to the forts they built there, and in 1868, the Lakota won. The Bozeman Trail was cut off. It was not a long-lasting victory. Other connections, including a branch of the Union Pacific Railroad, would come up through here, and it would be kind of a Pyrrhic victory. But the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 would be signed. And in it, the Lakota acknowledged they won, but still agreed to the reservation. So if you think about it, that was the American strategy, the U.S. strategy anyways. And so it wasn't a true victory. I would normally talk a little bit more about this, but the Treaty of Fort Laramie, this is the reservation right here. This massive reservation, almost half of South Dakota. And then all this land would be open for members of the tribe to go out in the summer and hunt buffalo. So they saw it as a big victory. They'd be fed here in the winter, go out here for buffalo. And that is the Great Sioux Reservation. But soon the Northern Pacific Railroad starts coming in here. Already have the Union Pacific coming in here, more settlers coming in. And that leads to the Great Sioux War, 1875 to 1877. Gold was found in the Black Hills, 1874. The Black Hills was not necessarily part of the treaty, but this was an incredibly important area for the Plains tribes. For some, it was a holy area. One of the biggies, if you've been to the Plains, there's not a lot of areas of lodgepole pines. The Black Hills are called the Black Hills because from a distance, it's black. These kind of weird upcrop of mountains are black because of the lodgepole pines. You need those for teepees and traverses. So this was a very important area that was off limits to settlement. But they found gold. Actually, the gold was found by a U.S. Army expedition under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, who's right there on the exhibition. Immediately, the word got out, a gold rush, all these settlers came in and violated the treaty. And of course, the Army came in to defend the settlers. You'll see this time after time in history. So the Lakota and the Cheyenne who lived in the reservation said, the hell with it. And they went out in 75 and 76 into this massive area that by treaty they were supposed to go to. Well, this is when President Grant decided we got to force them on the reservation and give up the Black Hills. So basically the U.S. is violating the treaty. So a massive operation of now the very small U.S. Army was used to try to surround and force the various tribes. Now there were maybe 4,000 to 6,000 total that hit the plains, a couple thousand in big massive groups, but there's not very many. And you think about there's not very many actual soldiers, and they can't be together for very long because of lack of food on the high plains. So a large column that was from what is now Missoula would be moving east. A large column, including the 7th Cavalry, under their second in command, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and another column here under a Civil War kind of hero, a little bit overrated, George Crook, coming this way. Hem them all in. This is a massive operation, absolutely massive. But Crook's force blundered into the Lakota and the Cheyenne, and they were nearly destroyed at the Battle of the Rosebud. They retreated. The main operation up here on the Yellowstone, they sent the cavalry, about 270 men, 7th Cavalry Regiment, under Custer, to try to find the tribe they knew were here. They didn't know about the Battle of Rosebud. Custer stumbled across the encampment here, June 25th, 1876, stumbled across them, knowing that they scattered, which was the norm. Remember, I mentioned this before. So ordered an attack, as it turned out, against overwhelming numbers. That's what's called the Battle of the Little Bighorn. June 25th, 1876. So this is Custer and the 7th Cavalry. They were considered elite, even though to any point of view they weren't elite. Sitting Bull right here was a warrior leader of the Lakota. He had fought the expansion of the United States forever. Hunkpapa Lakota. There's various sects. We're not going to go into details of that, but Hunkpapa, and he by then was too old to fight, but was very much a spiritual and political leader of the Lakota. But another Lakota by the name of Crazy Horse, there's no photos of Crazy Horse, so this is a painting of him. He and other warrior leaders, they would lead a couple thousand warriors against only 2,000 or 240 or so of Custer's forces. And Custer divided his army up. We don't have time to go on the details of this. Divided his forces up, and the part that he rode with, about 160 men who were going to try to attack the camp and take hostages, were surrounded and destroyed. And that is actually a picture in my background is from this is another picture from the same trip it's called Custer Hill, where they were destroyed. Now, when I was a kid, it was always called Custer's Last Stand, which is totally kind of obviously ethnocentric. But the Anheuser-Busch Company gave this picture to bars all over the United States beginning about the 1890s. And so that became the image of Custer's last fight. These are bones that they're reinterring them to dig. We're not exactly sure where they were buried. Eventually about 200, eventually about 60% of the regiment, or 40% of the regiment would be killed. The rest would hold out, and the Lakota dispersed. This was a humiliating defeat for the United States. But here's the key thing why it's so important. When word got back of this defeat, and Custer, who was a hero, was killed in this fight. I know I'm going so fast. Word got back to the United States. It took a while to get to the nearest telegraph line, which is at Fort Abraham Lincoln, which is Bismarck, North Dakota. And so it took a while to get back there. It arrived in Washington, D.C. and the East Coast on July 4th, 1876, the 100th anniversary of the United States. And the U.S. was furious and wanted revenge. Darn, I didn't quite finish. I'll finish the rest of this tomorrow. I'll drop these notes. Sorry, I went longer than I thought I was going to, but that's life. I will post this, and I will see you tomorrow. Well, I went way too long. Sorry.